First of all, we chose this topic because we believe that Australia has not solved the issue that affects Aboriginals. The country has not recognized them as the legitimate owners of the land, and it has not attributed the amount of importance they deserve regarding the identity of the country. Of course, they have included Aboriginal culture vastly in the sense of creating a general identity of Australia, but still in a very urbanized way, leaving outside many aspects that happened in the history of the country that are not mentioned or are manipulated in order to exclude those details that make the settlers the ones that just took over the land. Moreover, the fact that even in a country which has a huge variety of immigrants dares to call themselves multicultural when they still have not recognized the Aboriginals as an important part of their history and culture. Finally, we wanted to see how this issue has divided not only settlers and Aboriginals, but settlers too, since there had been different conflicts regarding the topic of Aboriginal land ownership and assimilation that had been proposed by people who is defending Aboriginal rights. What comes to your mind when you hear the word Australia? But what is Australia? What really constitutes Australian national identity? What is more, what is national identity? All these questions are going to be answered in this video. When we hear of Australia as a nation, we think of the geographical place defined by its borders and the people who live within. However, there is more to see of a country beside what is highlighted by a nation. In the case of Australia, some inhabitants of the country were convinced that it was a mirror of British customs with different landscapes from England. What is national identity? It could be defined as the sense of belonging people have to one state or nation. National identity states who we are, what makes us unique, and also who we are not. In 1983, Benedict Anderson coined the term imagined communities, which means that people imagine that they share something in common with their fellow citizens, even though they don't know each other and despite their cultural, social, ethnic, religious, and racial differences. This imagined community is shaped through the media, public symbols and ceremonies, and educational and political institutions. However, that is how identity is supposed to mean for Anglo-American sources and experts. Does that mean the same sense for Aboriginal or any other migrant culture that appears to live in Australia? The debate is still present nowadays, and for Aussies, this is quite a complex issue. We are used to think that Australia is full of white people wearing leather hats with crocodile fangs, driving huge trucks hunting alligators, and speaking really fast and with a somewhat Cockney accent, just like The Simpsons represented in one of their episodes where Bart was supposed to pay a bill to the Australian government and an apology to their people.
Hey, Gus! I got something to report to you.
That's a bloody outrage, it is. I want to take this all the way to the Prime Minister. Hey, Mr. Prime Minister! Andy!
Aye, mate. What's a good word?
Obviously, there is a stereotype of how Australians are described by American and Europeans alike. But most of these stereotypes come from Hollywood movies such as Crocodile Dundee.
British culture has deeply influenced Australian culture, but how so? All began with the arrival of the first British fleet in 1788. By that time, British established a penal colony in Sydney to relieve their overcrowded prisons. Since then, a process of alienation began, pushing Aboriginal people to the center of the country, denying their role in Australian culture. Nevertheless, after an entire history of conflicts, the Aboriginal culture is finally be incorporated in the mixture of cultures that create the identity of Australia. Of course, the acknowledgement that Aboriginal people receive is not enough if we take into consideration that the roots of Australia remain in their history according to what was discussed previously. Finally, the appropriation of indigenous culture complicated the process of assimilation because some people manipulated the incorporation of Aboriginal culture to other purposes, in some cases related with politics. Despite this, now we can see that when we use the word Australian, it is associated somehow with Aboriginal people of that country.
Final reflection. From all that we can recognize of Australia, it's actually quite difficult to identify what actually defined this country and its inhabitants. The subdivision within the country's cultural influences is directly related to the identity that Australians possess. Nevertheless, there are few aspects to take into consideration when we try to define a country's identity. That is, every inhabitant, since everyone living in a geographical country is relevant in terms of culture, Aboriginal culture, because the roots of every country begin in Aboriginal people, and it is very important to acknowledge that for every future generation, and finally every culture that is present in the country. Only then we can start talking about identity. Also, the process of assimilation in Australia throughout history has been very tough, especially for Aboriginal people, and that process is far from ending. But still, we need to recognize that there has been an improvement and more recognition, and we consider necessary to make that recognition more relevant in the future.